City University Television. In association with the Center for Advanced Study in Theater Arts. And the Clurman Endowment. Presents Spotlight.
Welcome to Spotlight. I'm Ed Wilson, and my guest is one of America's outstanding directors and producers in theater, Hal Prince. Hal, welcome. Hal, when you started out on Broadway as a producer, you produced a string of hits that started with Pajama Game and Damn Yankees and went through Fiorello, West Side Story, all the way through to Fiddler on the Roof, and everyone assumed that basically you were a producer.
Yeah,
because you were.
We love to pigeonhole people. Anyway,
I know it.
Country,
you were the most successful producer of musicals at that time in terms of Broadway.
I think David Merrick might argue.
Well,
with you.
all right. Well, along with David,
anyway.
along with David Merrick, certainly. But then, not suddenly. Actually, it probably wasn't that sudden. But in terms of appearances, you seem to be directing.
No, it wasn't sudden at all. Actually, what few people know is I let it be known that I wanted to direct in the late 50s. George Abbott was encouraging. Not too many people were encouraging, but one person who was, and I'll never forget it, was Roger Stevens.
Oh, really?
He was getting ready to produce, Juno, the musical version of Juno and the Paycock. Shirley Booth ended up playing Juno. And he actually asked me whether I'd be interested. And I actually said, it'll never happen, so I don't want to get my hopes up. That's not something that the authors, and it was Mark Blitzstein and Joe Stein, and I wouldn't blame them. Why would they ever let me do that? But he did, in fact, go so far as to say, if I put you up for this, would you be interested? And I said, yeah, but I'm not encouraging it. It'll never happen. And then around about the same time, Abbott directed A Funny Thing, and I produced it. It was the first musical I did after my partnership with Bobby Griffith, because Bobby died. So I got back on the horse, and I did, just about 1959, I did 2 shows. One was a straight play with Art Carney called Take Her, She's Mine, and Elizabeth Ashley. And that was a hit. And then almost immediately afterwards, A Funny Thing,
on the way to the Forum.
and that was a hit. And then Abbott said, you direct it in London. And he went to the authors and said, I'm going to have Hal direct it in London. And they had a meeting and said, that's unacceptable to us. So a bit grouchily, he went off to London, did it himself. But then it became known I wanted to do that. And so what happened was that T. Edward Hamilton, who ran
the Phoenix
the
Theater.
Phoenix, he's one of the co-heads of the Phoenix.
Right, he and Norris Houghton.
With Norrie Houghton, said, we've been asked by the New York State Arts Council to do a production to tour the universities in New York State. And we want to do The Matchmaker, the Thornton Wilder play, based on a Nestroy play.
Right.
Would you like to direct it? I jumped. I said, sure. And I did. And it starred Sylvia Sidney, Seda Thompson, Ralph Williams, Joe Ponasecki, a whole lot of wonderful people who are all with us and doing well. And we opened at Vassar in their theater in Rhinebeck. And it was good. It worked well. Ralph Dunn was the character man and had been in Pajama Game as the head of the factory. And that was my start.
Well, that must have given you a certain confidence about your ability.
It gave me a lot of confidence. I did a good job, frankly, and I'll tell you what happened as a result of that. Merrick heard about it and that I'd done The Matchmaker and asked me to direct Hello, Dolly, what became Hello, Dolly. And Jerry Herman came into the office and
wrote the music for him.
wrote the music and played the score. It was then called Dolly, a most unusual, extraordinary woman, I think was what they were calling the show. And they came into the Abbott office and played the score for me. And they got to this number called Hello, Dolly. And with all the arrogance I had no difficulty mustering, I said, "Are you crazy? What's this number doing in here? This is a show about a lady who is, all her life wants to go to the Harmonia Gardens. What do you mean we're so glad to have you back where you belong? This is nonsense. Read the play." And they very sweetly and in a gentlemanly way folded their music and walked out on me. And that was it.
So you didn't direct Hello,
So
Dolly.
I didn't direct it. But very curiously, almost at the same time, Bach and Harnick came to me we had done Fiorello, with a show based on Tevye and his daughters, and which became, of course,
Fiddler on the
Roof. And they said, "Would you like to direct it?" And I thought it was wonderful. And I said, "I'm ill-equipped to direct this. I don't understand the shtetl community. Though I'm Jewish, my background is German, and I don't understand that whole Eastern European Russian thing. And I'll tell you what," I said, "there's only one director I think should direct this, and that's Jerome Robbins." Well, Robbins wasn't available, and they said, "Oh, well, we have another musical. Would you be interested in looking at that?" And I said, "Yes." And that was based on Little Shop Around the Corner.
And that became She Loves Me.
Became She Loves Me. And that I felt instant affinity for. And I went to work with them and Joe Masteroff, and we did that show in that exact time slot. Now, if you look at She Loves Me, and you look at not Hello, Dolly, but The Matchmaker, you will see extraordinary similarities in the mood and the way the cafe in the play would work, the Harmonia Gardens, even some of the humor. And so, in fact, I ultimately did my version of The Matchmaker in that show, and they took their Tevye and his daughters to Fred Coe, who was a very important producer, and he optioned it. And a year or two later, 1964, 63, he went to Jerome Robbins, and Robbins was then available. And Robbins said, "I'll do it if Hal Prince is part of it."
Oh, really?
And
it came full circle.
And Fred Coe said, "Will you be my partner?" And so I went in there, and I ended up producing the show. So it all came around happily.
But then you really did, in terms of, you were moving more and more towards
Absolutely.
directing, and because then you got into things like Cabaret, which were completely...
Cabaret was 66, so that would be like 3 years later.
Yes.
In the meantime, there was a show called Flora the Red Menace, which was a flop, that I started to work on, based on a wonderful book called Love is Just Around the Corner.
I think it wasn't Liza, it was Liza Minnelli in that?
Liza was in it. That was her Broadway debut. She got a Tony for that. And I started to work on it, and then George heard the material, but this then was the new wedding of Kander and Ebb.
Right.
That was a marriage, another team that was getting going on Broadway. And Abbott heard the score and said, "Can I direct this? I'd like to direct this." And who's going to say no to George Abbott?
Right.
So the answer was yes. So he did that. And so that came after my debut on Broadway. I've even left out a kind of semi-debut on Broadway. It was actually my real debut. Was a show that was in trouble on the road called A Family Affair, that John Kander, Jim and Bill Goldman wrote. And it was a musical with Morris Karnofsky and Eileen Heckert, Larry Kurt, Rita Gardner, and so on. And it was being directed by Word Baker, and it was in Philadelphia, and it didn't turn out well. And they went to Robbins, and they went to Champion, and they used up and Abbott, all the successful Broadway musical directors. And then the agent for John Kander, a fellow named Dick Seff, who's since become a very good character actor, called the producer of that show and said, "I have a hunch. There's a guy who just directed The Matchmaker who wants to be a director. You'll know who he is, but you won't know him as a director. I think you should try them. And after all, what can you lose? Because you're going to close in Philadelphia on Saturday night anyway. So I took the train down there, and I looked at the show, and I stayed there. And I said to the actors, you're going to close on Saturday night. I have no credentials as a director, but we have exactly 2 weeks before we open on Broadway, and they're not about to postpone, but they are going to keep it open. If you will do everything I say, don't question it, do it. You can't be in any more trouble than you are right at this moment. Then I'll stay. And they had a little meeting in the other room, and very begrudgingly they said, all right. And in a period of 10 days, 80 pages of the script were rewritten. Scenery,
almost the entire script.
A lot of it. Scenery thrown out. David Hayes had done a very good job, but it needed some changes. They did it. Costumes changed. New music written. And we opened at what was then I guess it was called the Billy Rose. It's now the Nederlander down on 40th Street. And Walter Kerr gave us quite a good review. And my deal was that I would not take billing. By the way, I want to clear something up even. It wasn't really Word Baker's fault. It just didn't come together. And another head came in and took it somewhere else, which is sometimes easier to do as an editor than as a part of the original team. Anyway, I got very close to it. I got very proud of it. And I said, no, I'll take the billing. And so my name did appear on the billboard with that show, and it did run some few months. And I got baptized. And then I went on and did
well, and then of course, Cabaret and Zorba and a whole group.
Cabaret was the breakthrough. I did not have a hit, no matter what I did. Nothing I did worked until Cabaret. So by the time I went in rehearsal with Cabaret, I literally said, if this doesn't succeed for my investors, because everything Abbott did, mostly everything Abbott did and all the Robbins shows did, they were making money from everybody but me, then I'm going to stop. And thank God that one was a great big success, and I was really on my way.
I want to talk in terms of, because after that, you began your collaboration with Steve Sondheim.
Yeah.
And there was a whole course.
But all during that period, Steve and I were trying to get shows on.
Were you really?
Because we were very good friends. Steve and I are friends from when I was 20, he was 18. Not close, but we always knew each other.
And so you were talking about trying to work together?
We were talking about trying to work, and we had some projects. Steve has some wonderful songs from shows that we started that never happened.
And well, now Company was the first collaboration, wasn't it?
Company was yes, as director and writer.
Because
yes.
you'd produced West Side Story.
I produced West Side Story and Funny Thing, but the first real collaboration, artistic collaboration, was Company.
And then, of course, you did Follies and a little night music and Pacific Overtures.
Actually, he asked me to do Follies first. It was then called The Girls Upstairs, not to direct it. Again, I was their fourth choice as director, and my nose was out of joint. He then came back to me after a while, and I said, I will do The Girls Upstairs if you will do Company first. And then we'd found the Company material. So I put The Girls Upstairs on the back burner and said, if you'll do that, switch. And he said, if that's the way we're going to get the show I really want to get on, then all right, we'll do Company first. And then he fell in love with Company and did a spectacular job. So we did Company first, and then the very next year,
Follies.
Follies.
Which you'd already been working on.
Yes, and I think Follies, The Girls Upstairs, was a show with a wonderful score, a very interesting book, but it was very realistic. It was simply a bunch of people came into a stage at a kind of Ziegfeld Follies reunion in a real place and got very drunk and misbehaved and had a kind of catharsis, epiphany, and sobered up a little and went home. And I found it all real and not magical. And I suggested that we introduce these people when they were young and facing life and see the juxtaposition of them. And I thought it would give it a kind of poetry. And then Jim Goldman, who'd written the book, did extraordinary work to make that happen. And then Steve wrote songs that would never have belonged in that earlier version. And then Boris Aronson just lit it up.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the way you, because Boris Aronson was the set designer for several of your collaborations
Many.
with
A
Steve.
whole 10 or 12 year period.
And of course, you and Steve, what was the process like of developing these shows like Company and Follies and Pacific Overtures and A Little Night?
Well, the ideas came from all over the place.
Really? How did you all work?
Sometimes the idea was mine. Sometimes, in the case of Company, which was the first, it's a very interesting way that happened. George Firth was a friend of Steve Sondheim's, had written 7 plays, and Kim Stanley had agreed to play in them. 7 short plays, almost vignettes, in one evening. And Steve said, there's something wrong with this project, and I keep telling George, this is something wrong with it, George. Can I give it to my friend Hal to get a reaction? And I said, it's a trick. Kim Stanley is the greatest actress in the American theater, but she's going to be so busy changing wigs and makeup and costumes and accents. To what end? It's like a one-woman show.
Right.
But these plays are interesting, and don't you see that most of them, or many of them, are about marriage? Why don't we yank 3 or 4 of these plays and see if we can't make a modern musical about marriage? And that was an appealing idea, and we sat down in a room, and that's how that happened. Follies, I've told you how that happened.
Right.
In a minute, I'll tell you then the next process. Pacific Overtures, John Weidman brought me a play about Commodore Perry. It took place on Perry's battleship, flagship, in Edo Harbor, which was Tokyo, and it was about the incursions of the Americans into a culture which had isolated itself from the Western world. Very interesting, wordy play, but that's what it would have to be. And I said, this is such exotic territory. Why are we doing a wordy play with some Japanese people and some Americans all facing each other across a table in a ship? Why don't we explore the whole thing and make it a musical? And then I brought Steve in, and that happened. So there are all sorts of ways. And then Steve wished Sweeney Todd, thank God, on me. I mean, just throttled me with it.
You resisted Sweeney Todd?
I just thought it was the most unpleasant subject, and it's such a wonderful show. But, you know, it comes from different places. Well, but then the process, and for all the years of the Boris Aronson time, we do this. A book would be, generally the book would be written, and Steve would write a few songs to get a feel of what the quality of the music would be. I mean, like, for example, A Little Night Music was totally written as a play by Hugh Wheeler, and we had a reading with actors.
And with no songs?
Not a single song. And at the end of the reading, Steve and I looked at each other and said, this isn't a musical, this is one of the best plays, you don't need us. And my wife, who was at the meeting, took us aside and said, you're crazy. You're nuts. Go home and write the music. It's got to be a musical. And just sort of hit our heads together. And that became a musical. But what I would do, and this happened with that show, with all the ones that Boris designed, is almost at that moment we would start to talk the design of the show. He and I loved to talk.
Boris Aronson and you would talk for...
Never shut up. Barely had time to listen to each other, you know? Just endlessly talk. Argue, talk. Lisa Aronson, his wife, who was his assistant and motivated and really just extraordinary editor, she would endlessly, I vividly remember saying, Boris, shut up and listen. Hal just said something that you might have liked to have heard. and via that, we would talk for 6 months. And nothing would be designed. And
Was this true of each one of these shows?
Every bloody one of them. And I'll tell you how it worked. He was not interested in talking about visual things. He had a lot of photographs and etchings and paintings and lithographs and stuff all lying on a table which said something to him and to me. But mostly what he'd talk about is the sound of a place, the smell of a place, the food they ate, the mores of the society at that time, the emotional prevailing emotional attitude. Like you say to me, all right, what's New York like as you and I sit here? And I would say stressful, the overused word.
Right.
Well, we would find that equivalent to discuss Berlin in 1932, Greece, when we did Zorba, and so on and so on. And that conversation, that would take 6 months. Then he would go away, and he'd filled up so, and then I wouldn't see him for a while. And then he would present me with a show.
And of course, each one was different. I mean, the glass elevators in Company,
And there was always a surprise,
Really?
Ed. The glass elevators were a surprise. The mirror was in Cabaret, which mirrored the audience, which then appeared in oh so many shows, including a chorus line.
Surely.
For the same metaphorical reason, was originally a Cabaret surprise.
When you say surprise, you mean you didn't have any
I had
idea?
no idea it was coming.
Until he showed it to you.
And Lisa Aronson told me there's a brilliant exhibit at the in Katona, New York, of all of Boris's stuff, and I'd gone up to see it last year. And she said that when I looked at that model again, one more time, she said, I'm reminded Boris was so frightened to show you that. The day you came in to finally see it, he was so frightened. I said, to show me the mirror? It was a gift from heaven.
Isn't that something?
But that was I have since done that. I have ever since talked to designers that much.
Did you do this with Evita?
I certainly did.
And with
You
Phantom,
bet I
and
did.
Phantom of
With the O'Briens, and with Phantom of the Opera with Maria Bjornson. Talk. With Phantom of the Opera, it might be nice to jump to that because we couldn't figure out how. You're doing Phantom of the Opera. It's been made 7 times as a movie, and it's a thriller. And I don't need to do that, and it doesn't need me. It's something more interesting emotionally than just we'll reveal a grotesque face.
Right.
What is the psychological underpinning that makes that story so compelling? We talked, and we couldn't quite get a fix on what it should look like. And then I looked at a television show, and it was BBC television show showing on the PBS channel here, and it was called The Skin Horse. I don't even know quite why anymore. That was metaphorical. And it was a series of first-person interviews with people who were deformed in one way or another, physically handicapped and deformed. A lady who was speaking English, but you couldn't understand what she was saying, so they ran her words below, and you realize this woman is a genius and so articulate. And then a quadriplegic. And they kept talking into the camera. And there were many things they were saying, but one thing I did pick up on was that they were so normal and adjusted, and sexual matters were being touched on over and over again by some of them. And I called Maria Bjornson in London, and I said, come on over here, I'm going to run a television show. She flew over, and I showed her the 45-minute television show, and it unlocked the whole of Phantom of the Opera.
Really?
Because we started with the proscenium, which if you look at it on that show, is a very elaborate frieze of gargoyles and demons raping women and people lusting in a very open and overt and emotional way. And that proscenium dominates the whole show. And then we began to work, and the whole eroticism, which is what I think makes the show so probably successful. That's probably why it makes it so successful, is that whole sequence in the lair between those people. The way that looks grew out of the inspiration of that television show. And she looked at that television show and turned to me and said, we've got it. And I must say that whole technique is something that I owe Boris.
Of working so closely with the designer.
And looking for inspiration from that sort of thing.
It seems to me I once heard you say that you had to be able to see a show on stage in order to direct it successfully. And
Yes,
I remember
sir.
you said there was one show
Oh,
you
Merrily
never
We Roll Along.
never could see.
I still
Merrily We-
can't see it. We're sitting here. It's 1990. When did I do that? In the late 70s or 80, maybe
Yeah.
1980. I still don't know what it should look like, and so I bitched it up.
And so, but with all the others, you found what it either presented by Boris or Maria or whoever and in your own mind, you saw what it looked like.
Yes, sir. You bet. And I must not work on something unless I have that personal conviction, because I'm flying so blind. On Merrily We Roll Along, I know that right now I couldn't go back and improve on what I did the first time, because I still don't know where that's supposed to take place. I did have a theory originally, and this I think is touching on something that'll surprise you. I called my staff in and I said, the only way I can see Merrily We Roll Along is the way they did Our Town. On the empty stage of the theater, with a rack of clothes that the kids go and riffle to dress themselves up in adult clothes, and just some props, and it's almost as if they were putting together their life as they're going to see it. What do you think? I said, you know, theater tickets are up to $35 a seat now, or $40. Dare we ask people to pay that for no scenery and no costumes? And my general manager, Howard Haynes, he's since died, said, yes, you must do what you believe. And I didn't.
Ah.
I didn't have the guts.
And he was right, probably.
I didn't have the guts, and that touches on Broadway.
Yes.
Do you do a show on Broadway, a musical, for now $55 and have no
Or
scenery
even
and
$60.
Or even do you give them no scenery and costumes because aesthetically that's correct? I don't think I'd have the guts, which is inhibiting Broadway right now.
It really is, isn't it? I mean, it either
Artistically, sure.
because you can't do things now the way you used to do them in terms
You
of
can't come
money.
to that decision, and then maybe you can. Maybe people would pay $60 to see no scenery and costumes. I doubt
But
it.
nobody's willing to really try it.
No.
And the whole process has changed so much since you started out, and even since you did the early things.
Yeah.
Hal, I hate to say it, but our time is up. It goes by
Again.
goes by so quickly. Well, I'll have to ask you to come back. I hope you will.
I'll be happy to.
This has been Spotlight, and my guest has been Harold Prince. Thank you for being with us.